She didn't knock. She never did. Kayla Washington moved through the 50th floor penthouse office the way she moved through everything, like she belonged there, like the space had already rearranged itself to accommodate her before she arrived. Her heels made no sound on the polished marble. Her red dress caught the last dying light of the Las Vegas skyline behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, a single burning flame in a room built entirely of gray. Ji Lee didn't look up. And he never did, at first. That was their ritual. 3 years of it. Him at the mahogany desk, hands folded like a man in prayer, but eyes cold as a verdict. Her standing just close enough to make the air between them do something it had no business doing. The office smelled of sandalwood and whatever unspoken thing had been living between them since day one. Quiet, patient, dangerous. G turned a page in his ledger. His jaw was a locked door. Kayla placed both palms flat on the surface of his desk, her brown skin against the dark wood, her rings catching the light, her eyes steady, her posture pulled straight with the kind of calm that only belongs to women who have already decided. "I need 3 days off," she said. Her voice, low, smooth, unbothered, landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Starting tomorrow." G's pen stopped moving, not dramatically, not with a slam or a flinch. It simply stopped. The way a held breath stops. The way a city goes quiet right before something massive shifts underneath it. He still didn't look up. "The Bratva sit-down is Thursday," he said. Each word was measured, deliberate, the tone of a man who had built entire empires on the precision of his restraint. "You are irreplaceable in that room." "I know," Kayla said simply. "Move it to Friday." Now he looked up. And that, right there, was the moment the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees and somehow got hotter at the same time. His eyes found her face the way a security camera finds a threat, tracking, calculating, searching for the variable that didn't belong. But what he found wasn't defiance. It was something worse. Certainty. Kayla held his gaze without blinking. She had looked into those eyes for 3 years. She knew every version of Ji Lee that existed behind them, the strategist, the sovereign, the man who could bankrupt a rival with 4 words or rebuild loyalty with 2. She had studied him the way scientists study something both beautiful and catastrophic. She knew him, which is exactly why she knew what was coming. "Personal reasons," she added, a pause, precise, surgical. "I have a date." The room didn't explode, it compressed. Ji Lee's knuckles shifted against the desk, barely, almost imperceptibly, going white at the bone. The jade dragon tattoo on the side of his neck pulsed once, as if something underneath his skin had just been disturbed from a very long sleep. His jaw was still set, his face was still unreadable, but his eyes told an entirely different story. They weren't the eyes of a boss evaluating an employee's request. They were the eyes of a man who had just been handed something he did not have a protocol for. Something his entire organization, built on control, surveillance, and the cold architecture of power, had absolutely no framework to contain. Jealousy, raw, territorial, ancient. He stood, slowly. The kind of slow that isn't casual, the kind that means every muscle in the body has just agreed on something. He was tall in a way that the room confirmed rather than created. His suit jacket fell open as he rose. He moved around the edge of the desk, and Kayla, brilliant, fearless, dangerously composed Kayla, did not step back. She raised her chin. "A date," he repeated, not a question, a reckoning. "A real one," she said, "with a man who has never once made me feel like a line item on a balance sheet." Something moved across his face, there and gone in less than a second, but she caught it. She always caught it. Ji Lee leaned forward until the space between them was nothing more than a secret. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and yet it filled every corner of that room. "You are not going anywhere. Kayla." She smiled then, and it was the most dangerous thing in the building. What Ji Lee didn't know, what nobody in that office knew, was that Kayla had spent 6 days building this exact moment. Every word, every pause, every inch of that red dress, not to get 3 days off, but to keep him alive long enough to deserve them. Ji Lee did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark of his private office long after the building emptied. Long after the city below dissolved into a blur of neon and noise. The only light came from the 3 monitors on his desk, Surveillance feeds, encrypted communications, the quiet pulse of a tracking application he had activated within 4 minutes of Kayla walking out of that office. 4 minutes. That was how long it had taken the most controlled man in Las Vegas to completely abandon his principles. He told himself it was protocol. He told himself she was a security risk, an asset operating outside his awareness. That was all. He almost believed it. The tracker showed her at a jazz bar downtown, dimly lit, the kind of place that swallowed people whole and asked no questions. G leaned forward, his forearms braced on the desk, his eyes fixed on the small blinking dot that represented everything he had been pretending not to want for 3 years. He pulled up the bar's camera feed inside of 6 minutes. But he had eyes inside every establishment of significance in this city. That was not obsession. That was infrastructure. But when the feed loaded and he saw Kayla sitting across from a man in a gray suit, her natural hair swept back, her posture composed, but her hands wrapped around a glass like she needed something to hold on to, G. Lee felt something move through his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure. He studied the man. Mid-40s, clean, no visible jewelry. The way he sat, back straight, eyes scanning exits, was not the posture of a civilian. G had spent 20 years learning to read bodies the way other men read documents. This man was trained. Government, maybe. Law enforcement, almost certainly. G's jaw locked. He ran the face through his database. The result came back in under 90 seconds. Detective Ray Miller, Vegas Organized Crime Task Force, 18 years on the force, 3 commendations. 0 convictions against the Jade Dragon Syndicate. Not for lack of trying. G pushed back from his desk slowly. His secretary, his most trusted, most brilliant, most dangerous secret, was sitting in a jazz bar at 11 at night with the one man in this city whose entire career was built on dismantling everything G had constructed. The reasonable interpretation was betrayal. Any other boss would have already made a call. G did not make a call. Because there was something in Kayla's body language that didn't fit the narrative. She wasn't relaxed. She wasn't flirting. Her shoulders were carrying weight, and the way she slid something small and rectangular across the table, a drive, he realized, a data drive, was not the movement of a woman conspiring. It was the movement of a woman managing a situation far larger than herself. G stood. He reached for his jacket. He was already forming the question he intended to ask her, calmly, precisely, with the full force of everything he refused to name between them, when his phone buzzed. A message from his head of intelligence. 4 words. We found the mole. G went completely still. The name attached to the message wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some low-level operative he could dismiss. It was someone who sat at his table, someone who had access to every room, every plan, every location G had occupied for the last 2 years. Someone who would have known exactly where G would be on Thursday night. G looked back at the monitor. At Kayla, still sitting across from Detective Miller, her expression unreadable, her hands steady now. Not the hands of a traitor. The hands of a woman playing a game several moves ahead of everyone in the room, including him. He put on his jacket. He adjusted the cuffs with the methodical patience of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was a luxury he could not afford. Then he looked at her face one more time on that screen. The line of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the quiet devastation she was hiding behind composure, and something inside G. Lee shifted like tectonic plates. He had been watching her for 3 years. He had never actually seen her. What he did next would change everything between them, and he knew, walking out of that office into the cold Las Vegas night, that there was no version of this story where he came back the same man. The French restaurant sat on the 32nd floor of the Aria Tower, draped in candlelight and the kind of silence that wealth buys. White tablecloths, crystal stemware, the low murmur of conversations that cost money just to be part of. Everything about it was curated, deliberate, and suffocatingly elegant. Kayla walked in like she owned the floor. Her black wrap dress moved with her, understated and precise. Small gold earrings, her hair loose now, falling in full. There's dark curls around her shoulders. She had left the red dress behind, like armor she no longer needed, because what she was walking into tonight required something else entirely. Composure, invisibility, the specific kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself but makes every person in a room quietly aware. She was shown to a corner table. She sat with her back to the wall. That was not a coincidence. She had chosen this seat 3 days ago when she made the reservation, factoring sightlines, on exit proximity, and the precise angle that would allow her to monitor the room without appearing to do so. Kayla Washington had learned that particular skill from a man whose name she had spent most of her adult life trying not to speak: her father. But that was a door she was not opening tonight. Miller arrived 6 minutes late, which told her he had been watching the entrance. He sat across from her, ordered water, and said nothing until the waiter had retreated. "You have it?" he asked quietly. "Right here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something she had clearly been holding for days. Under the table, her fingers found the small drive in her clutch. Everything you need to intercept the soul transfer. Routing codes, the encrypted contact list, and the authorization signature they have been using to move capital. Miller reached for his water glass. "This exposes your position, Kayla. Why do you understand that?" "I understand exactly what it does," she said. Her eyes were steady. "What I need you to understand is that none of this came from the Jade Dragon. This is internal intelligence from the SEO faction, the group that has been positioning to take G out from the inside. If you use this correctly, you dismantle them before they can execute. G never knows I was involved." Miller looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight caught the tension in his face. And if G finds out anyway?" Kayla lifted her wine glass. "Then I'll handle G." She said it the way someone says a true thing that also happens to be terrifying. She didn't see the waiter approach from the left. She had been watching the right. That was her only miscalculation, the single degree of error in an otherwise flawless plan, and it would cost her. The man moved too smoothly, no pad, no second glass. His right hand stayed below tray level. And in the half-second, it took Kayla's instincts to process what that meant. A hand closed around her wrist from behind, not Miller's hand. She knew whose hand it was before she turned. She knew the temperature of it, the controlled, deliberate pressure of fingers that had never once touched her accidentally. G. Lee stood directly behind her, his grip around her wrist not painful but absolute, the grip of a man who had decided, somewhere between his office and this restaurant, that he was done pretending. His eyes were not on her. They were on the waiter, who had now stopped moving entirely, his hand still hidden beneath the serving tray. "Set it down," G said quietly, "and walk out of this restaurant. You have 30 seconds before I stop being polite." The waiter's eyes flicked across the room, a signal to someone, a calculation, and then he set the tray down on the nearest empty table and disappeared through the kitchen door. Miller was already on his feet, a badge in hand, moving to cut off the exit. G pulled Kayla upright in one smooth motion and placed himself between her and the room. His back was to her now, his body a wall. Kayla's heart was slamming against her ribs, not from fear, or not entirely from fear, from the proximity of him, from the warmth radiating off his back, from the realization that he had found her, tracked her, and shown up not with anger, but as a shield. "You followed me," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I did," he said. No apology, no explanation, just the bare, unguarded truth of it. That was the moment she understood that something between them had already crossed a line neither of them had drawn, and neither of them was going to step back over it. G didn't ask her a single question until they were in the car. The drive away from the Aria was silent in the way that pressurized rooms are silent, not empty, but loaded. Every molecule in the space arranged around something that hadn't been said yet. The city slid past the windows in streaks of amber and blue. Kayla sat with her hands folded in her lap, her clutch pressed against her side, her breathing even and measured. She had trained herself not to fill silences. That discipline had served her well in 3 years of working beside a man who weaponized quiet. But tonight was different. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years. She was not entirely sure she knew what came next. The plan had worked. G was out of the building. Minho's trap would close on an empty room. But sitting in the dark beside a man who had just shielded her body with his own, she found herself navigating something her planning had not fully accounted for. Not danger, not consequence. Something quieter than both of those things and somehow harder to manage. She kept her eyes on the passing city and said nothing, and hoped he mistook her silence for composure, because in that moment, it was the only thing she had left. G drove himself. No security detail. He had sent them ahead as a decoy. His hands on the wheel were loose, easy, the posture of a man who appeared relaxed in the way that only ever meant the opposite. The jade dragon tattoo along his neck caught the passing streetlights at intervals, a dark pulse in the dark. "The drive you passed to Miller," he said finally. Whose intelligence was on it? Kayla turned to look at him. How long have you known? Long enough? That's not an answer. His jaw moved. Since the jazz bar, I ran Miller's face. He paused. I almost made a very different call. The weight of what he wasn't saying landed squarely in the space between them. Kayla understood him well enough to translate. He had come close, very close, to treating her like a threat. But you didn't, she said. No. A beat. Because your body language was wrong for a traitor. You were scared, Kayla, and you don't scare easily. He glanced at her once, brief, clinical, and somehow the most intimate thing he had ever offered her. So I waited. She looked out the window. The files were from inside the SEO faction. They have been running a parallel intelligence network inside your organization for 14 months. The man you trust to run your sole operations has been feeding them everything, meeting schedules, asset locations, your movement patterns. She paused. They were planning to move on Thursday. The temperature in the car dropped. Thursday, G repeated, his voice stripped of everything except the word itself. The Bratva meeting was a setup. They wanted you in that room. Kayla turned back to him. I needed you out of the building. I needed a reason you would actually respond to, something that would get past every wall you have. Her voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes did. You don't respond to logic when you have already decided something is settled, but you respond to losing things. G didn't speak. So I gave you something to lose, she said quietly. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely, not pressurized, but cracked open, like the moment after something breaks and before you decide whether to mourn it or rebuild. G pulled the car to a stop on a quiet street above the valley. The lights of Las Vegas spread below them like a fractured galaxy, beautiful and indifferent. He cut the engine and sat with his hands on the wheel, and for the first time in 3 years, Kayla saw something on his face she had never seen there before. Exposure. You used my weakness against me, he said. Not an accusation, just a man holding a truth up to the light. Yes, she said. To protect me. Yes. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and the full weight of Ji Lee's attention was not a small thing. It was consuming. It moved across her face the way a man reads something he's been waiting years to understand. Her dark eyes, the curve of her jaw, the quiet, fierce intelligence behind her composure, the fact that she was still sitting straight, still unapologetic, even now. You could have just told me, he said. You would have locked down the building and gone after them yourself, she said, and the plan would have collapsed. We'd never get the root. She tilted her chin slightly. I needed you reactive, not calculated. I needed you human. Something moved through his expression, shadow and light in quick succession. And the man? He asked. His voice was quieter now. The date? Kayla held his gaze. There was no man, G. The admission fell into the car and sat there. G's throat moved. Or he reached out, slowly, like a man disabling something dangerous, and his hand closed around hers where it rested on the seat between them. Not possessive, not demanding, just contact, warm and deliberate and 3 years overdue. We have a problem, he said, his voice barely above a murmur. I know, she said. And neither of them moved. The safe house was 40 minutes outside the city, buried at the end of a dirt road that didn't exist on any map G hadn't personally drawn. A low stone structure, climate-controlled, stocked for a 2-week stay. He had built 3 of them across Nevada over the years. Quiet insurance against the kind of night where the city turned against you. Tonight qualified. Kayla moved through the space quickly, efficiently, running the same quiet audit she ran in every new environment. Exits, sightlines, communication systems. G watched her from the doorway, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled above his forearms, and something occurred to him that he couldn't immediately dismiss. She moved like she had been trained, not by him, not by anyone in his organization, but by someone who had known what they were doing. He filed the observation the way he filed everything, silently, precisely, for later. She found the first aid kit without being told where it was. She sat at the low table and spread the kit open, then looked at him with an expression that tolerated no argument. Sit down, she said. He had a cut along his forearm from the glass that had shattered at the restaurant during the exit, minor, barely worth acknowledging. He sat anyway. Her hands were steady as she cleaned it. The press of antiseptic-soaked gauze was careful and unhurried. Neither of them spoke. The desert outside pushed its silence against the walls, and the lamp above the table cast a circle of warm light that made the rest of the room feel very far away. G watched her face while she worked, the small concentration line between her brows, the way her lower lip sat just slightly apart, the particular stillness of a woman who was thinking 3 conversations ahead of the one she was having out loud. He let her finish. He let the quiet sit between them for a full breath after she set the gauze down. And then he said the thing he'd been carrying since the moment his intelligence report came through 6 hours ago. "Your father," G said, but her hands went still on the table. Not a flinch, not a recoil, just a complete, total stillness, the kind that only lives in a body that has spent years rehearsing how not to react to that particular word. A long moment passed. The lamplight held them both. Then she said, very carefully, "What about him?" "His name was Marcus Washington," G said. He kept his voice level, neutral, the tone he used when the truth required a steady hand to carry it. "He ran intelligence operations for a private syndicate out of Atlanta in the early 2000s. He disappeared 20 years ago after a failed contract." He paused. "The contract was on my father." Kayla set the gauze down. She looked at his arm rather than his face, and in that avoidance, G read everything she wasn't ready to say yet. The architecture of a woman who had carried this for so long that the weight had become structural. Remove it too quickly and something collapses. "Hey, you knew," she said. It wasn't a question. "I found out 8 months after I hired you." Now she looked up. Her eyes had shifted, not to anger, but to something more complex than anger. The particular devastation of someone who had been trying to control a narrative and just discovered how many pages of it had already been written without her. 8 months, she said slowly. "And you kept me?" "Yes." The words sat in the room, simple, undecorated. "Why?" she asked. G was quiet. Not the quiet of a man gathering words, the quiet of a man deciding how much of the truth he was prepared to give, and whether partial truth was something he was still capable of in this room with this woman after tonight. He chose all of it. "Because Marcus Washington was a man I could not protect," he said. "He made choices that put him in the path of forces I was too young to intercede against. By the time I had the power to look for him, he was already gone." His eyes stayed on her face. "You were not gone. You were 24 years old and brilliant and sitting in my lobby with a resume that should have gotten you hired by 3 governments. And there was a debt on your father's name being carried by people who would have used you to settle it without hesitation." Kayla had gone very still. The kind of still that isn't peace, the kind that is a person holding themselves together by force of will alone. "I paid it," G said, "every quarter, through channels that couldn't be traced back to either of us for 3 years. The ledger is closed. The people who held it believe it was resolved by a third party." A pause, long, deliberate, loaded with everything he was about to add. "You were never in danger from that debt. I made certain of it from the day I found out." The silence that followed was the longest of the night. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room in which something enormous had just been set down after being carried for an extraordinary length of time. Kayla didn't move. Her hands were flat on the table. Her eyes were fixed on a point just past his shoulder, and G watched something move through her face the way weather moves through a landscape, not destructive, but total. Covering everything, changing the surface of it. She breathed in, she breathed out. She lowered her head, just for a moment, just one. And the tight, immaculate control she wore, like a second skin bent slightly in the lamplight. Her curls fell forward. Her shoulders carried something they were no longer pretending not to carry. It lasted only seconds. When she raised her head again, her eyes were bright with something she absolutely refused to release. Her jaw was set, her back was straight, and the particular quality of her composure now was different from before, not because it was weaker, but because it was real. This was not the composure of a woman performing strength. This was the composure of a woman who had just been seen completely for the first time and had chosen to stay. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was barely sound. "You would have left," he said. She didn't deny it, and the fact that she didn't, the honesty of it, landed between them with a weight that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. "The park moves on Thursday," she said after a moment. "We have 48 hours. G looked at her. This woman who had built a trap out of his own heart to save his life, who carried her father's ghost in her spine, who had just absorbed a revelation that would have broken most people and was already moving forward. "Yes," he said. "We go together," she said. It was not a request. Ji Lee, who had run his empire alone for 15 years, who trusted no one in the room when the room got dangerous, heard those 3 words land in the exact center of his chest, and he said nothing, because silence between them had always meant yes. The name on the intelligence report was 3 syllables long: Min-ho Seo. Ji read it twice. Not because he needed to. He had understood it the first time, processed every implication in the single second it took his eyes to move across the page. And he read it twice because there was a particular cruelty in confirming certain things, and he believed in giving himself exactly enough time to feel it before he buried it. Min-ho had been with him for 11 years. He had stood beside Ji at his father's funeral. He had held the organization together during the 3 months Ji spent rebuilding after the Bratva War of 2019. He had a seat at every table, access to every vault, but clearance that surpassed every other member of the Jade Dragon by a margin Ji had granted personally. He was, in every language that mattered in this world, a brother, and for 14 months he had been selling everything. Ji set the report down without a word. Kayla was watching him from across the room, her arms folded, her dark eyes moving across his face with the careful attention of a woman reading weather. "You already knew about Min-ho," Ji said. "I suspected him 4 months ago. I didn't have confirmation until 6 days ago when I intercepted a dead-drop communication between him and the Soul Handler." She paused. "I needed the drive from Miller's database to verify the financial routing. It confirmed Min-ho has been moving clean money through a shell architecture he built inside your own accounts." Ji's expression didn't change. That was the most frightening thing about him, the absolute stillness of a man whose internal weather could level a building while his face remained a locked room. "You ran this entire operation alone," he said, "for months, inside my house without telling me." "You would have moved on him immediately," she said, "and the Soul Handler would have disappeared. We'd have the branch but not the root." "You used yourself as bait," Ji said. His voice dropped into that register, low, almost quiet, that the people who worked for him had learned to fear more than shouting. "You walked into that restaurant knowing there would be an attempt." "I walked in knowing you were watching," she said. "That is not the same thing." The room held that. Outside, the desert was doing what the desert does at night, pressing its silence against everything, indifferent and eternal. Ji stood. He crossed the space between them slowly, and Kayla held her ground the way she always held her ground, chin level, shoulders square, every inch of her composed and certain. He stopped close enough that she could see the precise line where the lamplight ended on his jaw. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "about your father." Everything in Kayla's expression shifted, not broke, not cracked, but shifted, the way a tightly held fist shifts when the thing it has been gripping is finally named. "Marcus Washington didn't fail his contract," Ji said. "He refused it. He was given the order to eliminate my father, and he walked away. In this world, walking away costs everything." He held her gaze. "He left because he found out my father had a son. He decided that orphaning a child wasn't something he could carry." A pause. He chose his conscience over his contract, and it destroyed him. Kayla's jaw moved once. "Aoife, my father spent the last decade of his life trying to locate Marcus Washington," Ji continued. "Not for revenge, to repay the debt. He died before he could find him." Ji's voice was stripped of everything decorative, just the bare, load-bearing architecture of the truth. "I have been finishing that search for 7 years. I found the record of his death 2 years before you walked into my lobby." The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was the heaviest thing in the room. Kayla exhaled, one slow, controlled breath, and something behind her eyes shifted from the weight of a secret finally released into open air. "So everything," she said quietly, "everything you did for me was his debt," Ji said, "and mine." He paused once more. "And eventually, something else entirely." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. And what happened next, what passed between them in that silence, in that lamplight, in that small room at the edge of the Nevada desert, was the kind of thing that cannot be organized or contained or filed into any ledger Ji Lee had ever kept. It could only be felt. They had 41 hours. Kayla mapped the operation on the safehouse wall using encrypted data from Miller's files and 3 years of intelligence she'd been quietly cataloging inside her own memory. G watched her work, the precision of it, the speed, the way her hands moved across the map like a woman who had been trained to read terrain as instinctively as language. The plan was elegant and ruthless in equal measure. Minho believed G was walking into the Bratva meeting Thursday night with his full inner circle, including Minho himself, positioned at G's right hand as always, a detonation sequence already armed and waiting on a phone in his jacket pocket. Kayla's plan did not involve stopping Minho at the meeting. It involved letting Minho believe the meeting was still happening, while G and Kayla used the 41-hour window to access the soul handler directly. Not the branch, the root. Bypass Minho entirely, extract the handler, and allow Minho to detonate a room that would already be empty, broadcasting to every faction watching that Geely had not only survived their most sophisticated attempt, but had done so without them ever knowing he had moved. The psychological impact matters as much as the physical outcome, Kayla said, her finger tracing the route from Vegas to the private airfield. If they know you knew, they adapt. If they think they failed on their own, that their own plan simply didn't work, they fracture. They turn on each other trying to find the failure point. G studied the map. Then he studied her. You think like an operative. I grew up with one, she said. The words landed without ceremony. But G heard everything underneath them. The childhood, shaped by a father who was brilliant and gone, the knowledge acquired in the space where that man should have been, the particular capability that grief builds in people who refuse to be destroyed by it. They left the safe house at 4 a.m. The desert was cold and dark and indifferent in the way that only the desert can be, as though the land itself had decided long ago that human drama was not its concern. G drove. Kayla navigated. Between them, the silence had changed. It was no longer the loaded silence of the past 3 years. It was the silence of two people who had stopped pretending and had not yet decided what to build in the space where the pretending used to live. They were 40 minutes from the airfield when G's phone lit up. Minho. G let it ring twice, then answered. His voice was flawless, the exact register of an undisturbed man. Yes, there's a problem with Thursday's arrangements, Minho said smoothly. 11 years of practiced loyalty in every syllable. The Bratva contact wants to move the location. I'll send you the details. Send them, G said. I'll review tonight. He ended the call. Kayla had heard everything. He's adjusting the trap, she said. He still doesn't know we moved first, G said. Good, she said. And the way she said it, quiet, precise, Shika completely without mercy, was the last confirmation G needed of everything he had been slowly understanding about Kayla Washington for 3 years and 1 night in the desert. She had not stumbled into this world. She had been born inside it, shaped by it. And she had walked into his office, carrying a purpose she had been building toward long before the day she crossed his threshold. The full shape of that purpose was the thing G intended to ask her, the moment they landed. Because what happened at that airfield in the next 6 hours would determine not just whether the Jade Dragon survived, it would determine whether anything between him and Kayla could exist outside of secrets. The soul handler's name was Director Yoon. He was not a soldier. He was the kind of man that dangerous organizations kept in the background precisely because he looked like no one. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in rooms that had no idea he was there. He landed at the private airfield at 6:47 in the morning, and he walked directly into Ji Lee. The look on Yoon's face lasted exactly 2 seconds before the professional mask slid back into place. But Kayla had been watching from the secondary position, and she caught it, the fractured instant of a man realizing that the architecture he had spent 14 months constructing had somehow, impossibly, collapsed before the final stone was placed. Ji gave him no time to reconstruct the narrative. Director Yoon, the soul transfer has been rerouted. The authorization codes have been invalidated as of this morning. Every account built inside my infrastructure has been frozen. His voice carried the tone of a man delivering whether factual or inevitable. You have one decision to make. You tell me everything about the CO Factions network, or I let Detective Miller's task force process the 1,200 financial transactions your name appears on. Yoon looked at Ji for a long moment, Then he looked at Kayla. Something moved across his expression, recognition, and beneath it something older than recognition, the look of a man confronting a lineage he had not expected to meet again. "You're Marcus's daughter," Yoon said. The airfield went very quiet, not the ordinary quiet of an early morning. Something different, the specific silence that falls when a sentence lands and the world needs a moment to rearrange itself around what was just said. Kayla stood completely still. The morning air moved around her. Her dark curls caught the pale early light, and her face, that face that had held everything together through a restaurant ambush, a desert confession, a night of revelations that would have unraveled most people, was absolutely unreadable. No one spoke. G, standing 2 feet to her left, did not move. He let the silence exist. He let it be the size it needed to be, because he understood without needing to be told that this moment, this exact moment, was the one Kayla had been moving toward since before she ever walked into his building. Every file she gathered, every risk she absorbed. Every day she sat across from him and said nothing about what she was carrying. It had all been pointed here. He would not rush her through it. The wind crossed the airfield. Somewhere in the distance a plane was taxiing. The world continued its business, indifferent as always. Then Kayla breathed. "You knew my father," she said. "I worked with him," Yoon said, 19 years ago, before the contract." He paused. "He talked about you. You were 6 years old. He kept a photograph in his jacket." Something moved through Kayla's face, there, and then gone. Sealed, contained. But G had seen it, and he understood the size of what she was holding. "Then you know," she said, her voice returning to that register, ice and iron, beautiful and unbreakable, "that I didn't come here for G." G turned to look at her fully. "I came here for the record," Kayla said. She stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate motion that makes a room understand who holds it. "The SEO faction has the file that documents what happened to Marcus Washington after he refused the contract, who ordered the fallout, who authorized his disappearance." She let that land. She let Yoon feel the full weight of what she knew and what she was prepared to do with it. "You are going to give me that file. And then, and only then, you are going to tell G everything he needs." Yoon looked between them, a man calculating, searching for leverage, finding none. "The file is in Seoul," he said. "Digital archive. I can give you the access sequence." "Write it down," Kayla said. G watched her stand over that man. No raised voice, no theatrics, no performance of power, and he understood, with a clarity that had been building across 3 years and an entire night, exactly who Kayla Washington was. She had not been waiting for G to save her. She had never needed saving. She had been running the most patient, most complex, most personal operation of her life from inside the one building that had access to everything she needed, beside the one man whose resources and whose eventual loyalty would make it possible. She had walked into his life carrying her father's ghost and her own agenda, and 3 years of extraordinary patience. And she had sat across from him every single day, brilliant, composed, essential, and she had waited, not for him to fall in love with her, for the right moment to finish what her father had started, and she had built that moment herself. Minho's detonation sequence fired at 8 o'clock that Thursday evening, as scheduled. The Bratva meeting room on the 50th floor exploded with precision and silence. By then, every camera in the building had been remotely looped. Every surveillance record showed Ji Lee entering at 7:59. No one in that room was harmed, because no one was in that room. Minho discovered this from a federal holding facility in Nevada, where Miller's task force had placed him at 7:45, 14 minutes before the detonation he had spent 14 months engineering. The look on his face, G was later told, was not rage. It was awe. G allowed himself exactly one moment of satisfaction. Then he turned to the woman sitting beside him in the private jet cabin, her dark curls catching the low cabin light, the Seoul file open on the tablet in her hands, her eyes moving across the documentation of her father's final chapter, with the quiet devastation of someone who has spent their entire life reading a story and has just reached the last page. He did not speak. He did not offer anything. He simply stayed. And after a long time, long enough that the Nevada lights had dissolved beneath the clouds and the Pacific had begun to appear below them, Kayla closed the tablet. She did not cry. That was not her way. But she exhaled, slowly, completely, and leaned sideways until her head rested against G's shoulder with the weight of 3 years and a lifetime of carried things finally set down. G turned his head until his cheek rested against her hair. And the most dangerous man in Las Vegas held the woman who had saved his life the way a man holds something he has finally, irreversibly admitted he cannot live without. Hawaii was not what G Lee typically chose for himself. He was a city man by architecture, built for glass towers and encrypted meetings and the particular energy of rooms where everything meant something other than what it appeared to mean. The open horizon of the Pacific, the indifferent generosity of sunlight, he the sound of water that had no agenda. These were not things he knew how to inhabit. Kayla apparently did. She had chosen the property herself, a private estate above Lanikai, surrounded by the kind of quiet that the world outside their lives had never offered either of them. She walked through the space on the first morning with the ease of a woman who understood instinctively how to make a location feel claimed, open windows, bare feet on warm stone. Her hair loose and full around her face, a linen wrap in cream instead of the red she had worn like armor through everything that preceded this. G stood on the terrace watching the water and trying to remember the last time he had been somewhere that did not require a contingency plan. He couldn't find one. "You're calculating exits," Kayla said from behind him. He didn't turn. "Habit." "Stop," she said, not unkindly, just with the particular authority of a woman who had earned the right to say it. He stopped. She came to stand beside him, leaning her forearms on the terrace railing, her eyes on the horizon, the morning light doing something specific to the lines of her face, illuminating the intelligence there, the quiet strength, the beauty that had never been the most interesting thing about her, but that the morning seemed determined to honor anyway. "The file," G said, "your father's record. What will you do with it?" Kayla was quiet for a moment. "There are 3 people named in the authorization chain. The 2 below Yoon are already in federal custody. Miller's team moved on them 72 hours ago." She paused. "The name at the top is a sitting official in Seoul's Ministry of Trade." G turned to look at her. "He has significant public exposure," she continued. "A corruption investigation would dismantle him more completely than anything else we could engineer." She met G's gaze. "I already sent the relevant documentation to 2 journalists and a parliamentary oversight committee this morning." G stared at her. "From a secure relay," she added. "Untraceable." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, Ji Lee smiled. Not the controlled expression he deployed in rooms full of people who needed managing. Something real. Something that moved across his whole face and made him briefly, unexpectedly, entirely human. "You did that over the Pacific," he said. "While I was asleep." "You slept for 4 hours," she confirmed. "I was not idle." He absorbed this, the full implication of it, that something in him had finally, in the presence of this particular woman, released enough to rest, and that she had used that time not to rest beside him, but to finish the last piece of a 20-year mission with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "The Jade Dragon," G said. "After Minho's removal, the inner circle needs to be rebuilt from clean infrastructure. The Seoul network starts from zero." He looked at her. "I want you in that room, not as my secretary." Kayla looked back at him. Her dark eyes were steady and deep and completely without performance. "What room? Exactly." "Every room," he said. "Every decision, every table." A pause. Equal standing. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough to let him feel the weight of what he was offering and know that he meant it without condition. 3 days off first, she said. 3 days, he agreed. She turned back to the water. He turned with her. And they stood there in the Hawaiian morning, the Ice King and the woman who had outmaneuvered him at every turn, saved his life with a lie, buried her father's ghost, and dismantled a 14-month conspiracy while wearing red, watching the horizon with the particular quiet of two people who have stopped pretending and found, in the silence underneath, something worth building. Somewhere over Seoul, a parliamentary oversight committee opened an encrypted attachment and began to read. Somewhere in Nevada, Minho Seo sat in a federal holding room and turned the same question over and over in his mind, unable to find the answer. Somewhere in a private jet hangar, the financial records of the SEO faction were being processed by 3 separate intelligence agencies simultaneously, each believing they had discovered them independently. Kayla had sent those too. The Jade Dragon did not fall on Thursday night. It evolved. And the woman standing barefoot on a terrace above the Pacific, the morning warm on her face, and the weight finally gone from her shoulders, Jade had been the architect of that evolution long before Ji Li ever looked up from his ledger and saw her. Some wars are won with weapons. The most dangerous ones are won with patience. Kayla Washington had always known which kind she was fighting. She had simply been waiting for Ji Li to be worth winning it for. If this story found something in you and held it, that is exactly where it was meant to land. Subscribe right now because the Jade Dragon Chronicles are only beginning and part 2 is already coming. Drop your city in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And tell me honestly, did you see that ending coming? Like this video, share it with someone who deserves a great story today, and I will see you in the next chapter. The Jade Dragon never sleeps. K.